This is the third video dealing with the immigration module. Let's begin by looking at the learning objectives for this video. First, we're going to examine the relationship between the average income of an immigrant group and the resulting geographic settlement pattern that that group has within the United States. Just let me explain a little bit further for one moment. Remember, there's a lot of diversity within the new immigrant groups that have come to the United States. Some are relatively wealthy and some are basically working class. And so what we're going to do is we're going to flesh out the relationship between that economic position and the resulting geography within the United States of America currently. Then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to 5 case studies. Each one of them is basically a national group, a recently arrived national group within the United States, and we're going to examine their geography. And hopefully, by looking at their geography, we'll be able to say something about the average income of that particular group. We're going to examine Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, who technically are not an immigrant group because Puerto Rico is a part of the United States, but they are a relatively recently arrived group, and so they kind of behave like new immigrants. We'll also look at Indians, i.e. from India, from South Asia, Chinese, and finally Cuban. Each one of these 5 is a representative case study of new immigration flows into the United States, and you'll notice that they're either Latin American or Asian, which of course are the 2 biggest components of source areas for immigrants to the United States today. So let's begin by looking at this relationship. It's probably for a lot of you fairly obvious, but I want to explain exactly how this relationship tends to be expressed. What we're looking at is the role of average income. Make sure you understand average in this case. We're not saying that everyone in that group is rich or poor, but if there is a group that has a high average income, for example, we might expect something that would be the product of that within its geography. So here's how the relationship basically is expressed. As income goes up, geographic concentration goes down. Here's another way of putting that. If a group arriving in the United States on average is professional, already well educated, perhaps already knows English, and is of already middle class status, they're less likely to live in just one city or just one collection of neighborhoods in one city or region. And the reason is that when they're already arriving with credentials, a professional degree or whatever it might be, they have a lot more choices. They can live wherever they want. They go where the work is. So they tend to be scattered. Whereas a more working class group is going to be somewhat more dependent on a community in existence that maybe knows their language, can maybe help them find a job. And so therefore, chain migration might be more important if you've got relatively low average income for any particular group. Now, there's another relationship as well. As income goes up, not only does geographic concentration go down, but also the role that geographic proximity plays tends to become less important as well. Let me explain what that means. If you're a relatively poor immigrant, you need to struggle quite a bit just even to get to the United States. So let's say you're coming from Ireland. You might be able to afford the flight from Ireland to Boston, but once you get to Boston, you're going to stay there because you don't have any further resources that would allow you to penetrate a little bit more deeply into the American interior. So Boston is the closest part of the United States to Ireland. It's one of the reasons why Boston, even today, is one of the most Irish American parts of the United States. So geographic proximity plays a role in explaining why there is a great concentration of Irish immigrants in the northeastern part of the United States. It also explains perhaps why there are a lot of Cubans in Florida and a lot of Filipinos in California, because California is the closest part of the United States, except for maybe Hawaii, to the Philippine Islands. However, as income goes up, then geographic proximity is not going to play as much of a role because the limiting constraints of not having a whole lot of money are no longer going to play such a factor. So let's begin by looking at this. One of the things that we mentioned in the second of the four videos that we're looking at with regard to immigration is that there is an incredible amount of diversity with regard to these new immigrant groups. That diversity is expressed in a lot of different ways. There is, for example, language and ethnicity, but also in terms of income, education, and skills. Now, this data comes from quite a long time ago, 1989, but trust me, not that much has changed in terms of the diversity of these new immigrant groups. So, just to give an example, here are 3 examples of immigrant groups that, on average, tend to have, upon arrival, income that's already above the American national average. That doesn't mean that all Indians who arrive in the United States are wealthy. It just means on average, the income for Indian immigrants in the United States is pretty high. What you might conclude from this is that these 3 groups in particular likely are professionals. They already have a college degree. They already mostly know English, and as a result, they're going to have a geography that's characterized by a pretty low degree of geographic concentration. At the other end of the spectrum, these 3 groups here, people who've arrived from Mexico, Cambodia, or the ex-states of the Soviet Union, they tend to have lower income. And so the conclusion that we might draw is rather than being professionals, at least on average, they tend to be working class immigrants with less money, probably a stronger language barrier, and in addition to that, they fall into those 2 categories, either labor migrants or political refugees and asylees, at least in general. So there's a lot of diversity, and thus, when we look at our 5 case studies, we'll be able to see how that diversity plays out geographically. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with our first group, that is recently arrived immigrants from the Philippines. This is basically the geography of the population in the United States that claimed Filipino ancestry in the year 2000. And if you look down here at the legend, you can see that the darker reds or maroons represent areas where a pretty good share of the population identifies at least partly as Filipino. Now, when I look at this map, here's what I see. I see a really important area, and that's, of course, California. California really represents the one state where the greatest concentration of people of Filipino heritage tend to reside. So it's a very concentrated pattern. Notice that, let's say, Alabama, Kentucky, Ohio, and Wisconsin really have no counties that stand out. And so a really huge concentration in just one state. What I would conclude from this is that, by and large, Filipino immigrants to the United States have a relatively low income, because we have that high degree of concentration, and notice this, California is proximus to the Philippines. It's the first part of the United States that you would be able to reach or access if you were coming from a Pacific island nation like the Philippines. Now, one final thing we might say, and that is probably chain migration plays a really important role here as well. Imagine if you are a recently arrived Filipino immigrant, you might want to live in Los Angeles or San Francisco because there's already an established community there. And if you don't know English, if you don't know how to get a job in the United States, that community, that already existing community in those cities, is going to be able to help you. So chain migration also tends to be more important when you have a lower income group. Here's another group. Technically, Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. If you're born in Puerto Rico, you're already an American citizen, and you're free to travel anywhere in the U.S. with no additional paperwork. However, Puerto Ricans started leaving the island of Puerto Rico in really large numbers at about the same time as other new immigrant groups, since 1965. And so they kind of behave like newer immigrant groups. Now, what do we see here? Again, dramatic concentration. You have Florida, which makes sense because it's close to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is right about here. But also the northeastern seaboard, basically the New York City metropolitan area. The reason that's the case is because both Florida, especially Miami, and New York have a lot of direct flights to the capital city of Puerto Rico, San Juan. And so in a way, they're both geographically proximus. Again, we would conclude that Puerto Rican migration to the United States is largely a working class migration because we've got a high degree of concentration, and we also probably could make the assumption that chain migration is playing a really important role, as Puerto Ricans tend to pile up, if you will, in Miami and New York, where you already have established communities that can assist in the assimilation process. Now here's the exact opposite situation. These are immigrants from India. And if you notice, there's really no one state that stands out. I suppose maybe California, but also Illinois and New Jersey and New York. So what I'm seeing here is less concentration, which makes me then conclude that Asian immigrants to the United States, Indian immigrants I should say, have higher income. And they do, by and large, at least on average. And so what we're really just seeing then is the biggest cities of the United States really stand out. And as we pointed out earlier, the new immigration tends to be very metropolitan in its focus. Now imagine what this also means. If you've got higher income, you probably also perhaps know English because you went to college, you already have a degree. It could have been an English language instruction that you had as your college experience. And that's exactly the case here. If you already know English, you can basically go wherever you want. You're less reliant on a community in one of these established cities. And so you have a little bit more freedom to decide where you want to live, and you go basically wherever the opportunity is. The exact same thing is true, perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent, with Chinese immigrants to the United States. There's a little bit more of a concentration on the West Coast, which makes sense. It's closer to China. But notice, just like the Asian Indian immigrant population, there's really no one state that stands out. Finally, let's look at percent Cuban. Now, Cubans are actually an unusual immigrant group because they actually do tend to have relatively high income. At least the initial wave did. And subsequent waves of Cubans to the United States that came after the revolution in Cuba in relatively recent time, about the last 40 years, they've had lower income, but still average income for Cubans is relatively high. But the pattern, oddly, is not what we would expect. The reason is, if we look here, it looks like Florida is playing a hugely disproportionate role, and perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent, again, the New York metropolitan area. So, just as was the case with Puerto Ricans, Florida and New York are important. And in fact, Florida and New York are important for all Caribbean immigrant groups to the United States. But to get back to the point, there's a reason why Florida really stands out, and that is, even though Cubans do have a higher income, there's hope on behalf of a lot of Cubans who live in the United States that one day they might return to Cuba when the current government is finally dismantled and dislodged. And if that is the case, in some instances they'd like to be closer to home so they could go back and forth between the two countries. So the conclusion that I would draw about Cubans is we would expect them to be not so concentrated, but they are for a peculiar and unique reason, and that is hope that someday they may actually be able to return to the island of Cuba. Alright, there's only one final video with respect to new immigration, and that is our fourth.